All right, I think we should start. It's my great pleasure to welcome the speakers today for our DSI Africa webinar on persistent identifiers. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thanks. Yes. Right, so great, thanks, Matt. So let me just introduce our speakers and also at this time thank them so much for being available for giving us this presentation today. So we have Maria Gold. She's the product manager and research data specialist at the California Digital Library, where she is responsible for the University of California Curation Center's portfolio of persistent identifier services and directs the research organization registry, which is called RAW Initiative. And then we have Matthew Bass. Matthew is an accomplished and thought leader in research and scholarly communications with vast experience in scaling international technical infrastructure. He's the executive director of DataSite, a global community that provides scholarly infrastructure services for research output and resources. And then finally, we have Ivo. Ivo heads up engagement at ORCID and is responsible for their global community member adoption and support, as well as their sustainability strategy and its alignment with core strategies and values. So Maria, I believe you're up.
All right. Thank you, Rolanda. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's very exciting to have this opportunity to share some of our experiences working with persistent identifiers across the scholarly infrastructure landscape. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Rolanda. So today, what we're planning to do is spend a little bit of time at the beginning, sort of framing some of the bigger picture for you and some of the context in which we're working on advancing these initiatives. And then each one of us as a speaker will go into a little bit more detail about the specific kinds of infrastructure services and identifier services that we are supporting through ORCID and through ROAR and through DataSite to address how we identify and connect information about people, organizations, outputs, and resources. And then throughout the session, we will also try to have some opportunities for some audience polling and interaction, and then leave some time at the end to have some further discussion and Q&A.
All right, so that means next up, we'll go into a very quick audience poll just to find out who you are, and just before we start, and ask you like just a few questions before we actually get started. So let me just share my screen. All right, so here's the instructions. Let me just pop this in the chat, the link in the chat as well. All right, so just briefly, we would just want to know who you are that are joining us today. So you are welcome to type in your job description or title at your organization. Give it a few minutes. About halfway there. Mhm. So for those of you who have just joined, we're just running a quick Menti poll to see who's in the audience today. So please submit your responses. I'll give it 1 more minute. All right, great. So let's see who we have. Right, we have program directors for the NIH. We have program officer, phenotype data harmonization for RedCap, software developer, PhD students, web developers, data scientists, postdoc research fellows, graduate students, lecturers, system admins, postdoc. Wow, so it's quite a diverse audience. I'm happy to see this. I specifically wanted it free text so folks get to identify with their own job descriptions. All right, and now I have one more question before we get started. So we would like to know from you basically why you are here today. What do you think? How do you think persistent identifiers can help you? So we have some pre-filled options here, and of course, then we have other. So I don't have a text box for other, but I think we can hopefully chat about that in the chat later. What other reasons you may have for how persistent identifiers may help you. All right, so we have some answers here. Any more comments? Something is still open. All right, I think we have some content to use here. So it's great to see. All right, I think you guys can see the results live. It's great to see that there seems to be a balance here between enhancing your career profile and finding relevant content. All right, so this is it's nice to know. So for this, I'll open the floor for the presentation, and then we will circle back in the discussion time about how you think the persistent identifiers can help you, and what you may have learned after the presentation of how it could actually help you even more besides only these options. All right, I'll stop sharing.
Great. Can you go to the next slide, please, Rolanda? Great, thank you. So yeah, so diving into a little bit of the big picture context in which we're carrying out this work, I just wanted to start with a few general framing points. I'm here in this webinar today kind of wearing two hats. I work at California Digital Library, which is the system-wide library for the University of California system in the United States, and I work a lot on developing different kinds of persistent identifier services and tools to support the library system at the university, but also to support different kinds of infrastructure initiatives that go well beyond the university. So I'm here to talk a little bit about that perspective from being part of a big public university system, but then also later on in the presentation, we'll be talking specifically about the ROAR initiative that I help to lead. So in this notion of the bigger picture in which we're operating, we can really think about the research life cycle that kind of comprises a lot of the different kinds of activities that take place when different research stakeholders are pursuing a project or looking at how to support a project or discover the kinds of research outputs that emerge from a project. And this is really a cyclical process, a cyclical kind of framework that we're all operating in that really depends upon and involves many different stakeholders and a plethora of systems and tools as well. And so I wanted to start with this image in mind of the cyclical nature of research and also the interconnectivity of the different stakeholders who are involved in different aspects of the process, whether that's planning, whether that's obtaining approvals or writing data management plans, securing funding, granting funding. We have the stages involved in the actual project itself, the kinds of protocols, instrumentation, data analysis and data collection, and then moving more into the publication phase where we're looking at how research is actually prepared for publication, how research outputs are connected to each other, connections between data and preprints and publications or articles, for instance, and then how it gets disseminated in the wider world and how others can discover and reuse and assess that research. And so throughout this cycle, one of the things that that happens is a lot of questions or challenges that might emerge in terms of how we make sense of all of this. And so if you can go to the next slide, Rolanda. I wanted to lay out some of the challenges and questions that might come up for different research stakeholders, whether it's researchers themselves, research contributors wondering how best to obtain credit for their contributions, how to elevate the visibility of their work, how to identify potential collaborators. For institutions, some of the questions and challenges might involve how to discover and track all of the outputs by researchers at a particular institution, or how to support and work with researchers in complying with policies and mandates, and looking at publishers and those who are involved more on how to disseminate research. There's a lot of challenges and questions that come up around how do we identify where researchers are coming from, or what kinds of licenses or subscriptions institutions might have for certain pieces of content, how to make connections or establish connections between publications and data sets, and how to identify the organizations that are involved in supporting research. And lastly, the last stakeholder group I kind of wanted to highlight here, and of course there are more, is for those organizations that are supporting researchers in awarding grants or other kinds of research support. There are a lot of challenges that come up in terms of tracking the outputs of the researchers whose projects they have supported, and also tracking how those outputs are connected to other other components that come to play in the research life cycle. So this is kind of the bigger context in which Matt and Ivo and I are operating and really trying to support these challenges and questions to help support of common and open and global infrastructure system that everyone can participate in to help address some of these challenges. So let's go to the next slide. And the theme and the really common thread in what we're doing is really how we can use PIDs and open infrastructure to answer some of those questions and address those challenges. And that's really important because the function of these open identifiers is to really allow for open information exchange and interoperability across systems to really build connections across the research landscape and reveal insights about research. And there are benefits that really come downstream from building those connections and exchanges, like reducing administrative burdens on researchers and institutions, saving everyone time, saving everyone money, and also making the whole process, the whole landscape and life cycle more transparent and open, so we can really understand how things are connected, understand who's working with who and where research is coming from and those kinds of things. So that's really some of the downstream benefits of developing infrastructure that is open and that relies on these persistent identifiers. So next slide, please. And the thing that we really want to emphasize in the course of this presentation, especially for the researchers who are attending this webinar, because it seems like there are a lot of you, is that an important downstream benefit of working with these open tools and the identifiers that can support them is how they can help you raise visibility as a scholar and elevate your profile. And so a lot of the open tools that are being developed for researchers right now are being integrated with global persistent identifier infrastructure services, and through integrating them into research workflows, like we saw in the research life cycle, we can really help researchers get more involved in developing their personal brand and getting credit for their work and supporting the discoverability and citability of all of the research outputs and resources that they are contributing to. And so there's a kind of practical aspect to the importance of how we can connect up this infrastructure through identifiers and open metadata, but also some very important downstream impacts on the researchers who are working so hard to advance their projects, and that's a really important thing to be keeping in mind. Next slide, please. And so before we go into the specifics of the kinds of initiatives and services that we are developing at our respective organizations, I want to just suggest some general themes to be keeping in mind. And that really comes down to the importance of openness and collaboration. And, we are here specifically, representing a concrete set of persistent identifiers. There are obviously a lot more of them out there that you might have heard of, and we can talk more about that during the discussion. But what I really want everyone to be keeping in mind and focusing on is that this idea that it's not just about getting a PID. Getting a PID is not the only goal. It's not the end goal. It's really about how we can work together to use PIDs and open metadata together to make research more connected and more open and more equitable. And this is something that everyone has an opportunity to participate in, regardless of the kind of work you do or the kind of position that you have. There are many different ways to help make it possible for all of this infrastructure to be more open and connected, whether that's working more on the implementation side of things or working more on the advocacy and community engagement side of things, or working more on policy and developing certain kinds of policies or best practices to support more open research. So these are some of the themes that I wanted to encourage everyone to keep in mind as we go through the specifics of some of the individual identifiers that we'll be talking about today. So with that, I'll conclude the general kind of framing of this conversation and look forward to discussing more later on in the session.
Would you like me to take over, Rolanda, already?
Yes, Iva, so you can decide to share your own screen or
yeah, I think it's better if you click through, might as well, while we're on it right now. So if you don't mind.
no problem.
All right, yeah, take it to the next slide and one more. Yep. All right, that's the segment. So ORCID, connecting research and researchers, that basically says it all. We create a persistent identifier and a profile that connects everything a researcher does with all the other systems. Next slide, please. Yep, one more. Yeah, it's a build deck. So our vision is we always want to start with, because that's how the whole idea of ORCID got started. Our vision is a world where all who participate in research, scholarship, and innovation are uniquely identified and connected to their contributions across disciplines, borders, and time. Now, the PID, of course, comes into the uniquely identification, and then the rest comes into connecting across disciplines, borders, and time. Next slide, please. And we do that by providing three main services. The first one is the ORCID ID, or sometimes just called the ORCID. People seem to use both. Regardless, it is a free and unique persistent 16-digit identifier that the researcher owns and controls forever, which distinguishes and disambiguates them from every other researcher throughout their career. The second thing we provide is a record, or also known as a digital CV or profile, to capture the researcher's research-related information. And thirdly, we provide a set of application programming interfaces, so APIs, so computers can transfer the data between an ORCID profile or record and their internal systems in the respective research organizations. So that together provides the PID and the infrastructure needed for the systems to communicate to each other. Next slide, please. We've seen a lot of adoption. We have ORCID users or ORCID IDs issued to researchers in every country in the world. We have about 9.5 million yearly active records, so active profiles, of which 7.2 million are automatically being updated through connected systems. So that means that the researcher has granted other organizations as a trusted organization, and they can read and write the data. We have member organizations in 60 countries, and then we have about 26 consortia across the world, and there's more to come. Overall, we have about 1,300 member organizations that build an integration and work with ORCID. We also have, of course, the public API that's free to use, and we have sort of a public data file that we release annually that the community uses as well. Next slide, please. So researchers can benefit from ORCID in multiple ways. It helps increase visibility and discoverability of researchers' works, as it provides a reliable and persistent way to track research activities and output. It also helps ensure the research is correctly attributed, and it helps reduce errors and inconsistencies in publication records. So through an ORCID record, you can increase your visibility, your discoverability. You can track researcher output, also organizations. You get more recognition for your work, and it helps reduce errors because of keying in the same text every time, or copy pasting can normally result in errors, and this helps reduce those errors. Next slide, please. So the record can track pretty much all of your research activities, right? So we have affiliations in there, and the professional activities that you do, It can contain funding information. The publications can flow automatically into your record as well. Any other outputs you have, like data sets, can be registered there as well. Peer review work, additionally website URLs, and also other profile IDs, additional email addresses, and aliases that you may use to publish under. Ideally, the vital things like affiliations and activities are pushed through your record through connected systems. So organizations that you've granted permission to write to your record. But you can also add that information manually. However, having it pushed by other systems increases trust, of course. And in the end, it also creates an automation process so that you won't have to, ideally, you won't have to manage this profile yourself. Next slide, please. So how other systems connect to the registry, the way they connect to it improves the workflows, improves the functionality of the record for you as a researcher, but also for all the organizations tied within the research landscape that are connected to the profile. So they get access to your data if you grant that to them. They can complete the data in there. They can pull the information out of the records that can complete their own data, helping reduce errors as well. And it creates overall more trust and transparency of having the information flow freely through these connected systems, and making sure that all the information relevant to you as a researcher actually is attributed to you. So some examples here where, researcher, you can sign into your university's CRIS system that then reads the data from your ORCID profile, which populates the local information system they have, which results usually in your profile page or any other background information they want to have. Saves you time and also reduces errors. Alternatively, researchers sign into a grant management platform that then can extract the data from the ORCID record to pre-populate submission forms, helps you save data. Again, also provides more trust and transparency to the grant provider. And then researcher profile systems can, for instance, keep themselves up to date with your latest publications, right? If they appear in your record, then they get automatically pushed to the profile systems. So just some examples on how it saves time and creates more awareness. Next slide, please. One of the key focus areas for last year and also for the next couple of years is global participation, really increasing the participation in some of these underrepresented regions for us. As you can see from the map, we have 60 countries that we have members in. We have users everywhere, but there's some gaps there that we want to see more adoption for ORCID, so that the entire community can benefit more from being connected. So for that, we've created the Global Participation Program, which basically has two main segments in there. One is the Membership Equity Program, which is a discounted membership fee structure for consortium members, and that's based on the income index from the World Bank. So you go up to an 80% discount for low-income countries and 50% for low and middle income countries. And then additionally, we launched the Global Participation Fund, which has two grant programs in there. One is aimed at community development and outreach to fund local partners that build ORCID communities of practice. And the other one is the Technical Integration Grant, which funds the development of systems that are likely to drive participation in these underrepresented communities. We have 2 grant cycles per year, and the last grant cycle actually closed last week. So we had a second one since we launched. And we'll have another cycle coming up in Q4 of this year. So keep an eye on that and communications about that if you're considering or interested in applying for a grant. Next slide. Just on some transparency on where we awarded these grants. We had one cycle already awarded at the end of last year. There were 4 grants issued for community development initiatives and one for the technical integration. So EcoConnect Research and Education from Nigeria we'll be using the grant to create PID awareness and targeting funding and government organizations to generate support for improved PID infrastructure. Kenya Libraries and Information Services Consortium is training librarians to enable an ORCID community of practice, advocate to research directors, and grow repository connections and integrations to the ORCID records. And Africa Archive, the Pan-African Open Access Portal, will create more ORCID awareness with the aim to increase consortia and advocate for wider PID adoption as well. And then lastly, in terms of the community development grant, Université Virtuelle de Côte d'Ivoire is building an ORCID community of practice in Côte d'Ivoire, so they're using the grant for that. And then lastly, we had the technical grant integration for the Hamburg Technical University. This organization has basically is using the grant to have ForScience, who's the creator of DSpace Chris, build an improved ORCID login process. And that login process will then be able to be used through all the users, by all the users worldwide in this open system called DSpace Chris. As said, we've got another cycle coming in Q4, so keep an eye on that if you're interested in any initiatives or any grants for technical integrations. Next slide. Let's moving up to ROAR now.
Thanks, Stevo, and hello again, everyone. And so now I'm going to talk specifically about ROAR, the Research Organization Registry, which is a global community-led registry of open persistent identifiers for research organizations. Next slide, please. So this is a nice segue from everything that Ivo just outlined. And so to provide a little bit of context about what ROAR is and what it's trying to do. ROAR was launched in 2019, so it's a slightly newer persistent identifier, though it's now been around about 4 years now. And the idea in developing ROAR was that we had already seen the development of open persistent identifiers for researchers in the form of ORCID IDs, and we have also already seen the development of open persistent identifiers for research outputs, articles and data sets and other kinds of outputs through DOIs provided by DataCite and Crossref and other services, and the ability to identify affiliations and connect them to researchers and connect them to research outputs was kind of the missing piece of the puzzle. And so the idea was to develop an identifier that could disambiguate institutional names and provide a standard and consistent reference point for institutions to be able to fit into this puzzle of connecting the dots of research. And so what ROAR is really trying to do is provide an open registry of institutional level affiliations and associated metadata, and to do this in an open and non-commercial and community-led approach. So what we're really seeing and trying to achieve is to show essentially how research outputs and researchers are connected to institutions. So this is a very collaborative effort. If you go to the next slide, ROAR itself is actually not an organization. So picking up on this theme of collaboration, we're developing ROAR as an initiative that's operated by 3 different organizations: California Digital Library, Crossref, and DataCite. And we're supporting ROAR through those organizations, and also have a wider group of community involvement through various communication layers and working group activities and advisory group activities as well, to bring different stakeholders into the room. Next slide, please. So this is showing an example of one of the records that is in the registry right now. This is for the University of Cape Town. And if you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the details that are in the registry. So we are representing in the registry approximately 105,000 research organizations worldwide, and that number is continuing to grow. I'll talk a little bit about the process for adding and updating records in the registry in a moment. Every organization that's in the registry has a unique identifier that will always stay the same regardless of whether the organization name happens to change over time, which we know is quite a common thing, and additional descriptive metadata to support discoverability and disambiguation, because many organizations might share a name or have similar names. And so it's important to have additional metadata associated with the identifier that helps to distinguish it, whether looking at different variations of the name or acronyms. We have metadata as well for the location where the organization is based, and other identifiers that also exist for the organization, such as a funder registry identifier or Wikidata. And we make all of the information in the registry freely and openly available through a public search interface, which is what you're seeing in the screenshot, as well as an open REST API and a public data file. When we update all of the data in the registry, at least monthly, sometimes more than that, based on community input. And if you go to the next slide, talk a little bit about that process. So we are approaching the curation of the registry through a community-based curation model. We really encourage feedback from anyone and everyone about additions or changes to the registry, and we manage all of that community feedback through a centralized and transparent process that's openly available in GitHub. And we work very closely with an advisory board of curators who help to develop the overall scope and metadata policies that guide decisions about inclusion in the registry, and also how the metadata is represented. So if this is something that interests you, we are always looking for additional people to help advise on some of the metadata policies and curation practices that we're carrying out. So that's something that I would encourage you to get in touch with us about if it's something that interests you. So yeah, like I said, we're publishing updates to the registry approximately once a month, trying to have a pretty quick turnaround time to make sure that the information in the registry stays up to date and is as comprehensive as possible. So if you are taking a look at what's in the registry and you notice that something isn't there that you think should be there, or if you notice any issues with an existing record, like the name is incorrect or the website has been updated, that kind of feedback is something that we are always looking to have. Next slide, please. So thinking a little bit about the context and the use cases for how and why ROR might be useful. This kind of ties in a little bit to what Eva was talking about with the need for researchers to help elevate their visibility and get credit for their outputs and distinguish themselves from other researchers. And it's a similar kind of scenario when it comes to institutions and publishers and funders and other kinds of organizations that are involved in research, because there's a need to make sure that we can easily identify all of the research outputs that are associated with a particular institution and make that information as easy as possible to discover. And also for other kinds of stakeholders involved in different aspects of the research cycle or publication cycle, to be able to easily identify where researchers are affiliated, to easily identify the different research outputs that have been supported by a particular funder. And so all of these needs and use cases really depend on the ability to easily and uniquely identify the specific organization that is involved. And so that's where ROR is really coming into play. So on the next slide, I'll just share an example of a common workflow in the kind of publication context in which ROR can particularly be useful. So we think about the workflow starting when a researcher is submitting an article or a data set, and that system is integrated with ROAR so that when a researcher goes to input their affiliation, it can actually be, they can choose their affiliation from the controlled list that comes from ROAR. It's not just a free text field, which would mean entering an affiliation name in different ways, but we're really standardizing and controlling the options that the researcher is given so that that information can then be stored in with the metadata associated with that research output and then made discoverable in research databases that are grabbing and harvesting the metadata about different publications. So this is a sort of overview example of how ROAR can come into play in a generalized publication workflow. And then on the next slide, just show downstream a little bit of what that could look like. On the left, showing an example of how the affiliation metadata and the standardized ROAR ID can be included in the DOI that is registered in DataCite in this case. And we also see the ORCID ID being associated with the researcher as well. And so we see this puzzle coming together where we can really connect the ORCID IDs to the ROAR IDs to the DOIs and really make all of this information as clean and consistent as possible to help the information be exchanged across different systems that are involved in tracking research. And on the right, showing an example of DataCite Commons, which I know Matt will talk about in a moment, which really depends on different open identifiers and open metadata to show visualizations about research outputs and show the connections between researchers and institutions and research products. So this is just showing how the metadata that ends up being registered in with the DOI, for example, can become really useful in downstream services to help really show the impact and visibility of different kinds of research. And on the next slide, and also the second to last slide, just zooming out a little bit and looking at the bigger picture, again, of how we really connect these different pieces of the landscape. We can see that when we have a network of identifiers and open metadata and this ability to connect information across all of these different systems, we can really more easily understand these relationships and connections between the different stakeholders in the research landscape and the different kinds of research activities that are taking place. So that's really the vision that we hope to achieve in supporting this open research infrastructure that everyone can participate in and benefit from. So on the next slide, and I think we'll be sharing the slide deck with everyone after this, I just wanted to leave everyone with some notes and reminders and an encouragement to get involved in ROAR if this is something that you're interested in. And we also have a lot of resources available for people interested in developing an integration or understanding more about the curation process and things like that. So when we circulate the slides, please take a look at this and get in touch if you're interested. So now I will pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Maria. And I did help answer a question in the chat there. I put in an old Google Doc for the curation request, Maria, so you might want to actually put in the updated link. Sorry, I see I've put in the wrong one there, but
great, thanks.
You can just put in the updated one. Cool, thanks. So you can move to the next slide. Thanks, Rolinda. Yeah, great to be talking to you all. I think firstly, it is perhaps helpful to just kind of frame DataCite as a community and what we do. And really what we are as DataCite is a global community with a common interest. And this is a community of research organizations or organizations involved in research globally, and that really look to ensure that research outputs and resources are openly available and connected. And this is also that research outputs and resources can be reused, and that this can advance knowledge across and between disciplines. And so many of you will be involved with organizations or work with systems that are members of the DataCite community. And I think this is an important point in that we as persistent identifier infrastructure organizations really want to provide the backbone underlying infrastructure to the core services that you use as researchers. And so I've sometimes, I guess, use the analogy of a train. When I go and catch a train, I don't necessarily need to know all the details of how the train system works, but I need to know the key pieces of, okay, I can pay here, I can get my ticket, I get on the card and I go from here to here, but I don't need to know all of the nuts and bolts of how the train system works. And I think that also relates to kind of what we're trying to frame a bit with you as researchers. You are very busy, have very important research agendas, and you want to focus on your research. And so we don't want to necessarily overburden you with too much information in the intricacies of persistent identifier infrastructure, but really show you the key pieces and touch points that you can interact with as researchers that help you in your work as key researchers. As a community of communities at DataCite, we want to make research more effective with metadata. And so this is a key piece behind these research outputs and resources. And this ranges from samples and images through to data and preprints. And this is something that we focus on a lot, is that research articles, journal articles are a very good, succinct description of research. But it's not the entirety of the research study. And so it's really important that we surface things like software, the protocols, the data management plans, the reports, the samples that were used in as part of the scholarly record, and make sure that there's credit for researchers that are involved in the research lifecycle, whether it's through a collaboration, international collaboration, or within a local collaboration, that these do have persistent identifiers, do have metadata, and are available for reuse by the global community, ensuring that you get credit for the work that you do. And we obviously integrate across the different services, and this is what I was talking about, the different touch points in making sure that we improve these research workflows. And then we work a lot behind the scenes, or not really behind the scenes, but with a lot of harvesters and aggregators, so your big indexes and search engines that look to power search and discovery, and that actually harvest metadata from DataCite to support that workflow. If you go to the next slide, thanks, Rolanda. We look to obviously partner throughout the community, and it's really about learning more about the needs, and not us as a technology provider saying this is the technology, this is what you need to do, but it's really about how do we as a community evolve, and how do we work together in line with the needs of the community and the context of how, I guess, research is funded, as an example, in a particular country or region. What incentives are there, and how do we ensure that we build an ecosystem around that, rather than saying, here's the ecosystem, plug this into what you're doing. I included a few folks that may be interesting for some of the work that we're doing in Africa. There are various efforts in Africa and presence, and so these are some of the folks that we're working with, not to mention obviously Orchid, Raw, Crosswith, which are key organizations that we partner with on a very big global scale, but these are some not only on a local scale, but particularly in Africa. Next slide. I mentioned a bit about the research outputs and resources, so I'll probably just jump straight through this, but really just trying to emphasize here that it's not just about articles as research outputs. It's a broad list of different outputs and resources that we work to connect together. Next slide, please. Our focus is in 4 key areas. One, we look to create DOIs. And so we might have an opportunity, if we have time, to go through a brief example of doing this in Zenodo. After this, I can show as an example. But creating DOIs, which then has metadata associated with that, and that makes these resources and outputs discoverable. We integrate workflows, so we work with systems and services to integrate with our APIs. We work to enable this discovery. This is what I was talking about with harvesters. So we have harvesting mechanisms that aggregators and indexers will harvest this metadata, which ensures that your research and outputs are discoverable and citable, importantly. And then we also promote reuse with various tools and technology that provide interoperability. As an example, ORCID auto update. So if we have a DOI with an ORCID ID, it automatically can get linked to your ORCID record. And we can also show an example of that workflow working live in a moment. Next slide, please. Ivo mentioned a bit about the ORCID Global Participation Program. Similarly, at DataCite, we have a Global Access Program. And our focus here is towards an equitable and inclusive research ecosystem. I touched on the partners, but really here it's focusing on metadata management, data citation, data repository management, and really helping to streamline the research data lifecycle. So we're just getting going with this program. And if you are at an organization that is interested in working with DataCite around DOIs for outputs and resources, please do reach out. We are in the process of onboarding dedicated staff across various regions that are joining the team. And really, ultimately, the program is set up to create a more equitable and inclusive research ecosystem that we as a global community can work together as a community of communities. Next slide, please. There's three components to the program. One is that we will be providing funding. This is, I guess, for context, infrastructure funding towards services and tools and infrastructure within the region that aligns with persistent identifier infrastructure services. We are initially going to be looking at, I guess, three key areas, the one being local infrastructure, and that's being established. The second being international infrastructure that's being customized for the purposes of regional efforts. So in this context, with context of what's needed in Africa. And the third being a focus on indigenous knowledge efforts. So those are the three key funding areas that we'll be working on. We also are working with a number of technical infrastructure partners to support these efforts in designing and setting up this infrastructure. We have a couple partners that are interested in providing free services such as archiving as an example, also additional funding to capacity building that communities would be running with groups in the community. Yeah, next slide, please. Importantly, and this is what I alluded to at the start, is that I guess from a researcher's point of view, obviously many of you may wear a couple hats, but from a researcher's point of view, really what we want to talk about is leveraging these free and open tools. And so a couple things here, kind of high level things that would be beneficial is one, depositing research outputs and resources in things like in repositories that are linked to DataCite. So these, as an example, Zenodo, Dryad, Figshare, there's many of these free repositories, generalist repositories, as well as domain-specific repositories that are available. You can create data management plans with DMP tool, which also ensures that you have a DMP ID. You can include your raw ID on your outputs and resources when depositing these outputs or submitting manuscripts. You can link your ORCID ID to DataCite, and this ensures that your ORCID ID will automatically be updated as soon as an output is published or linked to your ORCID ID. And then you can also leverage DataCite Commons as one example to track research outputs and resources linked to various entities. Maria showed some examples of doing this from a organization point of view, using a raw ID saying, tell me about all of the different research outputs and resources that are linked to this organization. Next slide, please. And so one thing that you'll see in the coming months, the developers are currently working on this at DataCite. On the left, you see a visualization, again, leveraging RAW. This is a research facility, Tetaroa Society, where they are have a number of research outputs and resources. You can see the aggregate citation counts, the views and downloads of these research outputs and resources across the repositories. You can also see the different links between those outputs in the graph, different indicators about your about the fairness of those outputs and resources. So making sure that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And then on the right-hand side, you see a visualization that will be bringing together links around a DMP. And here you can see the different contributors, so the individuals, their different roles, and the different outputs that they are linked to. And so you'll start to see a lot more of these visualizations that help you kind of track things in your research workflows, and are able to showcase the work that you're doing. These are all free and open tools. And I guess across all of the presentations, myself, Ivo, Maria, we're happy to share any more advice or any tips and interesting tools that you may be interested in. I think next slide. I can't remember. I think that's it. Yeah, that's all I had. I think we wanted to shift now to a discussion, if I'm correct, Rolanda.
So before we go into the discussion, I just have a few more Menti poll questions. And then we could probably also incorporate that into the discussion. For 1 second. While I just get that up and running. So this was the Menti study for the first session. Just give me 1 second. Right, so those who have joined us later, this is the instructions for the Menti poll. We're just going to have a couple more questions, and then we will go into the discussion and question and answer session. I'll just give you a few minutes to open this up if you haven't done so already. All right, great. I see a few thumbs up. So now that we've heard about the organizations and persistent identifiers, the question to you is, where do you primarily deposit research answers that are not journal publications? You can select one. As before, I don't have the space to enter other, but we can definitely enter other options in the chat, and then we can discuss this in the Q&A session. and give you a few more minutes to give responses. See, there's quite a number of you on the webinar today. Okay, interesting to see many of you are making use of the repositories and registries. So I have two more questions. So I'll quickly move on. So the next question to you, if you can identify the challenges experienced in adopting infrastructure tools. Sorry about that. I see now I eventually made it a single select option, but that's okay. Anybody else can share any other challenges that are not mentioned here? Please do so in the chat. Thanks, Bethany. Thanks, Catherine. Now, I purposefully didn't also select too many. I want folks to also think about it and put some in the chat of the challenges. Right, so I'll keep this open maybe for a few more seconds. But do think of other challenges, then we can also discuss this in the Q&A. Yeah. All right, then this final question. Okay. Finally, do you think your university organization should do more in adopting the All right, I think I can stop there and open the floor for questions. So thanks guys for adding your voice to this talk by participating in the poll. I think it's very useful for the speakers to gather information this way. All right, sorry, this is a bit noisy on my side. But yes, so there's been a few questions already in the chat. I think Matt and Maria and Ivo have done some work in addressing these. Are there any other questions? You are also welcome to raise your hand and ask your question.
Rolanda, maybe while folks, I know sometimes folks need to just kind of think about framing questions. Do you want me to do I can do a very quick 2-minute demonstration. I actually had preloaded this presentation in Zenodo, and I can show everyone live how that actually works, just depositing something and how persistent identifiers flow into that. Do you want me to jump into that, or unless
Sure.
there's somebody that has a question that?
No, sure, that will be fine.
Okay. So I will quickly just share my screen here. Just checking you can see my screen. Okay. So this is just a brief demonstration of, kind of a deposit workflow. So here I'm just using Zenodo as an example. So I put in our slide deck. It's a presentation. Zenodo is connected to DataCite, assigns the DOI. I can put in the title and I can go update these. I just want to do a brief demonstration. I've got all of the contributors and our ORCID IDs included here. And sorry, this might give me an error here. All of the details that I have this with the access rights. And I can now go and click save and then publish this. And it will now publish this work. This is now available and citable. So immediately it's got a DOI over here. So I can use this to easily cite this. And it's got a citation format here. I could also, if I wanted to, go to cross sites, and this is a tool that DataCite runs. So if I want to get this in a different format, I can essentially just put in the DOI and say, I want this DOI in, say, APA format, or say I want it in Elsevier Harvard. Let's just choose one and say format. It automatically gives me the citation format. Also importantly, what should happen, and so let's hope it's all working, the system, is that because that ORCID ID is already included in the metadata of this record, you see it's not here yet, but if I refresh, let's see, I don't know how quick, there might be some latency in the system, and I haven't actually tested this in a while, so let's see if the systems are talking to each other. No, not there yet. So it might be a while, it might be a moment, we'll come back in a moment, but essentially what should happen, or what should happen in a moment, is the system will basically pick up that ORCID ID and automatically add it to my ORCID record. You can see this is another example of something that was deposited and pushed automatically into my ORCID record. The other thing that we can do is make sure that all of the raw IDs are correct. And so as an example, in the metadata, if I take that, if I just go into this DOI, so this, I'm now going through DataCite's system, but I can just double check here that the affiliations are correct. So here, I think it is all right. No, why it's not. I think it's because it's already there. I will double check then. Maria's should be before, yeah. I think it's not picking it up because it's already there. So it seems to have come through. I'll double check the metadata now, and then we've got ORCID, and then that basically ensures that behind the metadata, there is the raw ID. So you can see here that this raw ID is the California Digital Library. And so those outputs are available. And we could also then go into tools such as DataCite Commons. Obviously, any tool can do this, but leveraging raw, we can go look for the organization. And we can pick up the different research outputs and resources related to California Digital Library, as an example. California Digital Library is probably not the best example, Maria, because I think a lot of this falls under the University of California. And so that's also, there's a hierarchy or relationships that exist in RAW, which is also a nice example. So, we could also look here for University of California and all of the outputs that are under California is also.
I think it's the system one. Yeah,
there we go.
right there.
And all of the works linked here and different publication years, the work types and licenses. So that's just a brief example. I could also search as an example for myself. This leverages ORCID ID. So this is in DataCite, and I can quickly pull up everything with my ORCID ID in DataCite. And this is also.
I don't think that's you.
It's not me. It's not my ORCID ID. And this is why ORCID IDs are great. This is actually Matt Bass, also another South African. I think he's based in New Zealand. That's my one, sorry. So you could pull all the related works and see everything linked to the ORCID ID. So there's different ways to use this, and I guess just kind of showing you that example workflow. Hopefully that helps a bit in kind of making it a bit more practical.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of just how all of these different systems can talk to each other when we are embedding and including identifiers in these different places in the research workflow and research lifecycle.
Let me address Daniel's question relating to the adoption map that I showed in the presentation, which was Sandia, is that a question related to Matt's demo? Because then maybe we want to address that first.
No, it's not. So okay. Please go ahead. I'm in line.
Cool. So the world map that had all the colors with the users and the members and the consortia. So how that relates is, again, going back, a researcher profile is free. Anyone can set that up, and it's owned by you. And then members can be either direct members. So those are organizations that pay a membership fee and are able to read and write the records and have some more benefits as well. They can either join through direct membership, or they can join a consortium if that is available in their country. If not, they can also work towards a consortium, right? So consortium can start from 5 members upwards. And then we need a consortium lead organization, of course, to sort of drive that community of practice at a national level. Additionally, a little bit of a scoop, but we are working on a regional consortium initiative that will allow multiple countries to band together to form a consortium, again, aimed at these underrepresented regions for ORCID, where sometimes it's either a financial challenge to start a small consortium with 5 members because the price drops as you have more members in a consortium, or there might even be smaller nations that do not have sufficient organizations to actually start a consortium, or they may not have an organization that is willing to lead the consortium, etc. So we're trying to cover that through in a new initiative that's coming soon. It's called the Regional Consortium Initiative. Hope that addresses the question, Daniel. If not, let me know.
Yeah, that addresses. Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, Claudia, I think you can go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, great talk. It was very helpful to learn about the three different, options and how to integrate those different things. I was wondering, I have two questions actually. One is related to patient IDs within data sets and so on. And is there any thought about then relating the data, even if it's internally within the organization, to relate the individual patient identifiers and then to a data set? And I realize there's a lot of confidentiality and all of those kinds of regulations that come into place, but I was just wondering about your thoughts on that. And then the second question, I guess, has to do with the use of AI, ML to kind of scour maybe websites and automatically draw information. Is there any thought on that, rather than having people register and do the, so yeah, anyway, that's kind of two things that I wanted to ask about.
Yeah, I can maybe mention on the patient IDs, I guess we would have to look at the use case. Obviously, yeah, privacy is a really important component there. In DataCite, in the schema, we have the concept of alternate identifiers or related identifiers. But I think this is slightly more abstract, and that's why I guess it would be good to understand the use case in more detail, because you may have a data set and then a related set of data or records that you want to relate, and it's important that we can, and there's different ways to describe that relationship. The schema has different relation types, and so you can say supplements, or I can drop in a link now with the different relation types. So that's something that we could definitely support. And if there's kind of more specific use cases needed, the metadata schema group could look at, I guess, adapting to support more of that use case. But yeah, in sort of high level, something that we could potentially do, but it wouldn't necessarily be to directly a patient identifier. Maybe a set of patient identifiers, depends on kind of the context of how you're using that. And if it's a set of patient identifiers, it would probably be some sort of record of those identifiers and linking that to the data set.
I was wondering if there has been requests like this. So for example, from the UK Biobank or from any of these other big consortia, whether there has been a request for that, not necessarily providing a use case, but asking if there were use cases, more like.
Yeah, no, not really. I think it's I guess on the patient identifiers, everyone's quite cautious around kind of privacy there, and so it's more around making the public data set available. There are folks like Vivly that we work with that have brokered access for certain things. We're working with the group at Max Planck that have things like neuroimaging data, which is actually considered under privacy under GDPR in Europe, and so there also has to be a brokered access. And so we have different workflows and best practice around describing the core data with metadata, but then getting to a landing page where there's brokered access and the ability to actually get that data, but following a process that addresses the privacy regulations within the region. So, and there's those type of things. In terms of patient identifiers, we haven't seen anything specifically. I don't know off the top of my head. I can ask some of the team, but not that I know of.
Okay. And then I wondered if anyone could comment on the use of AI/ML to sort of crawl different places, and if there are discrepancies, especially in like, okay, the same person is represented differently in different places, and because that can get pretty confusing for people who subscribe to these different registries, I guess, right? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good comment. I guess it happens in the DOI landscape a bit, where we have, but typically it's different versions of record. And so you might have a preprint, postprint type scenario. And I was actually on a call about this earlier today with ResearchFish and how they're looking at some of this. We can describe it in metadata, again, with alternate identifiers or related identifiers and a relation type. But often, sometimes we don't have that metadata. And so there is some thought or some thinking to be able to better identify that in a more automated way. Crossref do something known as similarity check across their data file, but it's just within their data file. And so the ability to do this across different indexes and registries is something that is important. In terms of kind of the, I guess, machine learning models, we are with the data citation corpus, which is an effort at DataCite. I'll put in a link in the chat in a moment, but that is looking at Cybert and GPT models to basically pull out citations out of articles and basically make those automatic connections, like this article cites this data set, so we don't have to manually do this in the metadata. So yeah, I think the community is evolving in that direction. We're just being very careful, in provenance and trust is really important. And so I guess you'll hear a lot of us saying, like you have in ORCID, multiple sources saying the same thing is good. Same with citation metadata. If the publisher says it, the repository says it, and a machine learning algorithm says, so you have three sources saying this citation exists, then you know credibly that the citation exists. So, and when we look at metadata and provenance and trust, that's something that is being explored.
Thanks, Matt. Questions from Laura.
And to that,
I see Maria wanted to say something first, though, so maybe you should.
Oh, I was just, did you want to talk about the sensitive data thing earlier? Because I think your hand was up before mine.
I had a separate question, so.
Oh, okay. I can just jump in briefly just on the topic of AI and machine learning, that this is something that we're, exploring a little bit on the ROAR side in a couple of different ways, but I definitely agree with what all of Matt's points about the provenance and trust side of things. So one of the things we've been exploring for a little while now is what we can do about affiliation data that is out there in different kinds of systems that is not associated with a ROAR ID, and are there approaches for matching those strings to ROAR IDs and at scale. And so that's something that we're exploring through the use of various kinds of matching algorithms and tools, but we really do need to, there's a lot of intervention that is needed to set it up appropriately and make sure that if something is being identified as a match, that we can actually verify that it's a correct match. And so I think one of the stages that we're at is exploring the potential, but also identifying the kinds of interventions or quality control of the training data that would be needed to ensure that we can that it's reliable and accurate.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was just curious, Matt, you mentioned that there's kind of upcoming formation of some kind of regional communities for DataCite, and you specifically mentioned that you're envisioning kind of an African community. I was wondering if there's any more details you could give to the group on how they could connect with that initiative and be more involved, or if there's a place they should look for more information when it's available.
Yeah, so essentially we already do have several communities in Africa and across the globe. We have a presence across 50 countries. But I guess more of a specific dedicated focus. We have Bosan, who has just joined us. He's based in Lagos and has just joined the team. We are ramping up the efforts in sharing more about the Global Access Program and some upcoming webinars, and working with some of the partners like UbuntuNet Alliance and some of the NRENs in the community, as well as some of the library and information services consortia, to set up kind of some of the key infrastructure around repositories and things. But we definitely want to make sure that we're engaging with researchers and the group. I will post a link to the Global Access Program webpage. And sorry, this is a bit, we currently transitioning to a new website, which will be launched next month. But I'll just post this link in the meantime. And if you have any questions, the key person is Gabriella. Gabriella's email is on the page that I just posted, and is the program manager, and we'll be able to support any questions, or if you want to learn more about the program and the work that we're doing.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So I wasn't sure if you had anything to add.
For me, I posted it on the chat.
Oh, all right.
Just very conscious of time because we're near the end there.
Yeah, sure. So that's why I actually want to then take this opportunity. I think we have a minute left. So if there are no more questions, then I really want to thank the three of you and Lombe, who is now not present here today. But thank you so much for your valuable insights. I think from this webinar, there'll be a lot of contact between us and you to further this consortium also in making their outputs more visible. So I just want to say thanks for your time today, and let the participants know that the recording and the slide deck will be available for distribution. So just put my video back on. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a good day further.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.